the refuge of Assisi and the call to rest. Welcome to Saints for Sleep, a peaceful refuge for your night. Tonight, dear listener, I invite you to travel with me along the dusty roads of medieval Italy, to breathe the air of the Umbrian hills, and to feel the warm sun resting upon the ancient stones of a city that bore witness to one of the most beautiful miracles the Christian world has ever known. We are going to walk beside a man who gave up everything in order to possess everything, a wealthy young man who chose to be poor, a soldier who became a messenger of peace, a troubadour who sang songs of human love until he discovered love with a capital L. And from that moment on, his entire being was transformed into praise. Tonight, we will come to know Francis of Assisi, the little poor man of Christ, the universal brother, the saint who spoke with wolves and preached to birds, who embraced the lepers and kissed the wounds of Christ. Before we sink into this story, let me share something with you. If this voice brings you comfort tonight, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to Saints for Sleep, so that every evening a new story of faith and hope will be waiting for you. It costs nothing, and it means everything. Now, let us begin. Settle in wherever you are. Let your body grow heavy against whatever holds you, your pillow, your blanket, the darkness itself. Take a deep breath and let me carry you to the city of Assisi in the year 1181 or thereabouts, when inside a prosperous merchant's home, the one who would change the history of the church forever was about to take his first breath. The medieval cradle and the two worlds of Assisi. To truly understand who Francis was, we must first understand the world into which he was born. Assisi was a small city perched on the hillsides of Umbria, in the very heart of Italy. Picture cobblestone streets winding upward in slow curves, stone houses with rooftops of warm terracotta tile, open squares where merchants displayed bolts of cloth and mounds of spice, where blacksmiths beat iron and bakers drew steaming loaves from their ovens. The air smelled of bread and hay, and the faint sweetness of olive groves on the hillside below. It was an age of violent contrasts, of sharp and clearly drawn light and shadow. On one side, Italy was experiencing an extraordinary commercial revival. Cities were growing, trade was flourishing. A new class of wealthy merchants was rising to challenge the old feudal order, and money moved with a freedom the world had rarely seen before. Merchant families accumulated fortunes, selling precious fabrics, Eastern spices, and luxury goods from distant lands. But on the other side of that gleaming prosperity lay a sorrow that no coin could soften. Lepers wandered the roads, driven from society, forced to carry small bells to warn the living of their approach. Beggars crowded the steps of churches. Wars between neighboring cities were constant and merciless, leaving behind fields of ash and women weeping for husbands who would never return. The church itself was passing through a time of complexity. Some of her members had settled comfortably into wealth and earthly power, forgetting the spirit of gospel poverty. At the same time, movements of protest were rising, voices that cried out against these failures, though in their urgency, some drifted away from the truth they sought to defend. It was an age that longed for reform, that cried out for a return to the simplicity of the gospel. That needed, more than arguments or edicts, living witnesses, men and women who would simply show the world what it looks like to follow Christ with nothing held back. Into this world, our story is born. His father, Pietro di Bernardone, was a prosperous cloth merchant. He traveled often to France, where he purchased the finest silks and linens he would later sell in Italy for handsome profit. His mother, Pica, was a woman of gentle spirit and quiet refinement. Some chroniclers suggest she came from noble lineage, though history has not settled the question with certainty. While Pietro was away on one of his French journeys, Pica gave birth to their son. The tradition tells us that she had a difficult labor and that a mysterious pilgrim came to the door and advised her to bring the child into the stable, just as the Virgin Mary had given birth to the Christ child. She did, and the boy was born without difficulty. Pica baptized him Giovanni, John, But when Pietro returned from France, full of affection for that country and all things French, he renamed his son Francesco, the Frenchman, the little French one. This small detail is not without meaning. From the very syllables of his name, Francis carried the mark of two worlds, the commercial pragmatism of his Italian father and the chivalric spirit of France that would shape his earliest dreams, and that God would one day transform into something no troubadour's song could contain. The Prince of Youth and the Failure of Glory, Francis grew up as a prince in his small commercial kingdom. His father spared nothing. The boy dressed in bright colours and fashionable cuts that set him apart from his companions. He had money to spend, and he spent it with open hands. By nature he was joyful, charming, and magnetic, the kind of young man who seemed to bring the celebration with him wherever he went. He sang troubadour songs in French, recited poetry, and organized feasts for his friends. The chroniclers of his time describe him as the king of the youth of Assisi. He was not the strongest or the most studious, but he possessed something that drew everyone to him: a natural ease, a boundless generosity, a laughter that was genuinely impossible to resist. He paid for everyone's food and drink in the taverns, distributed coins to his companions, and led festive processions through the streets of the city, walking at the front like a small and joyful sovereign, his court flowing behind him in the warm Italian evening. But beneath the celebration, something deeper stirred. Francis dreamed of something greater. In his heart burned the ideal of chivalry, those stories of valor and honor that drifted over from France, stories of crusaders who had fought in the Holy Land, of knights who defended the weak and won immortal glory. Francis wanted to be one of them. He wanted to cover himself in honor, to have his name remembered in songs. His father watched all of this with a mixture of pride and unease. Pride, because his son was popular, handsome, the center of every room. Unease, because the boy spent money without thought and showed no interest in the family business. Pietro dreamed that Francesco would follow in his steps, become an even more successful merchant, multiply the family fortune. But the young man had his eyes on the horizon, dreaming of deeds that ledgers could never record. The opportunity for those deeds arrived soon enough. Assisi and the neighboring city of Perugia were at war. One of those conflicts so common in medieval Italy, where cities fought over territory, over pride, over ancient grievances kept alive from one generation to the next. Francis, freshly 20, joined the army of Assisi. At last, he could prove his worth. At last, he could become the knight he had always dreamed of being. But the reality of war was nothing like the songs. At the Battle of Collestrada in the year 1202, the army of Assisi was utterly defeated. Francis, along with other soldiers of noble standing, was captured and taken as a prisoner to Perugia. There was no glory, no act of heroism, only the quiet humiliation of defeat and the cold weight of chains. He spent an entire year as a prisoner, a year in a dark, damp cell, sharing the space with other captives. It was his first true encounter with suffering, with helplessness, with being stripped of everything that had given him an identity, his fine clothes, his freedom, his role as the bright and admired young man of Assisi. And yet, even there, Francis kept his spirit. The other prisoners would later remember how he lifted their hearts, how he sang to raise their courage, how he shared whatever little he had. Finally, his father paid the ransom, and Francis was freed. He returned to Assisi, but he was not the same. His body had been weakened by his time in captivity. He fell ill, gravely, dangerously ill, and spent long months in bed, consumed by fever, hovering at the edge of death. And in that illness, something deep inside him began to quietly shift. When at last he recovered enough to stand, he went out to walk in the fields surrounding Assisi. But something had changed in the quality of the light. The landscapes he had once admired for their beauty now seemed to him strangely hollow. The plans for military glory that had once filled him with fire seemed empty, purposeless. He had looked death in the face, He had tasted suffering, and the gleaming certainties of his golden youth had developed cracks that no amount of festivity could hide. He did not yet know which road to take. The grace of God was working in the depths of his heart, gently preparing him, but he did not yet understand what was being prepared. He tried the life of knighthood one final time. He learned that a nobleman from Assisi was organizing a military expedition to the south, where glory and fortune awaited those willing to pursue them. Francis decided to join. He purchased a magnificent suit of armor, equipped himself as befitted a knight, and said goodbye to his family. But he only reached Spoleto, a single day's journey from Assisi. That night, a dream came to him, a vision. In it, he saw a great palace filled with armor and weapons, all marked with the sign of the cross. A voice asked him, "Who is it better to serve, the master or the servant?" Francis answered, "The master." And the voice said, "Then why do you follow the servant instead of the master?" Francis woke with a start, and somehow, with a clarity he could not explain, he knew he had to return to Assisi. His companions were bewildered. How could he abandon them now, on the very eve of their departure? But Francis turned around and went home. He did not yet know what his life was going to look like. He only knew, with a certainty that had no words, that the road of earthly chivalry was not his. God had other plans, though he could not yet see them. Perhaps you too know what it is to stand at a crossroads in the dark, without a map, without a clear sign, knowing only that the road you have been walking does not lead where you need to go. Perhaps tonight you are carrying your own version of that confusion, that longing for direction, for a voice that will tell you clearly, this way. Rest now in this story, because Francis too waited in the uncertainty, and the voice came. It always comes, not always when we expect it, but it comes. The encounter that changed everything. The leper and the crucifix. Back in Assisi, Francis returned to his old patterns, at least on the surface. He was still the life of the gathering, still generous with his money and his laughter. But something had shifted beneath the familiar surface. A restlessness, a searching, a question without an answer that kept him awake in the quiet hours before dawn. He began seeking out places of solitude to pray. He slipped away from celebrations early, seeking caves and hidden corners where he could sit alone with his thoughts and with God. And God, who never abandons those who seek him with sincerity, began to answer in ways that Francis never would have imagined. The first great encounter, the one his biographers consider the true turning point, took place on the roads outside Assisi. Francis was riding alone, taking in the open countryside, when in the distance he saw a figure that made something instinctive seize inside him. It was a leper. Lepers were the absolute outcasts of medieval society. Their disease, which deformed the body in terrible ways, was seen as a mark of divine punishment, something unclean, contagious, not only in body, but in spirit. They were required to live apart, in leper colonies, outside the city walls. When they walked the roads, they were forced to ring small bells to announce themselves, so that others could move away in time. And Francis, for all his generosity with his wealthy friends, for all his natural warmth and open-handed ways, had always felt a visceral repulsion toward lepers. A fear, a revulsion, that he himself would later confess honestly. Simply seeing them from a distance had always been enough to turn his stomach. But on that road, on that particular afternoon, with that particular leper approaching, something extraordinary happened. Instead of spurring his horse and riding quickly away, as he would have done without a second thought any day before, Francis felt an impulse rise inside him, a force that did not come from himself. He dismounted. He walked toward the leper. And then, overcoming every fiber of his being that screamed at him to flee, he did something unthinkable. He took the leper's hands, those hands deformed by illness, and kissed them. He embraced that man. And in the moment that he did, Francis himself recounts in his testament, he felt something astonishing. What had been bitter became sweet. The revulsion became love. The fear became joy. And when he climbed back onto his horse and turned to look back down the road, the leper was gone. Many who heard the story later believed it had been Christ himself, in disguise, testing Francis, showing him where he would find him from that day forward, in the poorest, in the most despised, in those whom no one wished to touch. This encounter marked the true beginning of Francis's conversion. From that day, he began to visit the leper colonies regularly. He sat with the sick, washed their wounds, fed them, prayed with them. The other young men of Assisi would see him passing on his way to the colony and murmur among themselves, puzzled. What has happened to Francesco? Has he lost his mind? Perhaps he had. But it was a divine madness, the kind the world calls foolishness, because it cannot comprehend the love that drives it. Francis was discovering something that would reorder everything he thought he knew. That Christ is found not only on the gilded altars of magnificent churches, but walking the dusty roads in the form of the outcast. That his face appears in those the world turns away, but God had still more to show him. One day, Francis was praying in the small church of San Damiano, a ruined chapel on the outskirts of Assisi, nearly abandoned, its stone walls beginning to crumble. Kneeling before its ancient crucifix, he prayed with his whole heart, asking for direction, asking to know what God wanted of him. And then something happened that would alter the entire course of his life. The crucifix spoke, not with words that ears in the room could have heard, but with words that resonated in the deepest place of Francis's heart, as clear as if someone had leaned down and whispered them directly to him. The voice said, "Francis, go and repair my house, which, as you can see, is falling into ruin." Francis looked around at the crumbling little church. The walls were giving way. The roof had gaps open to the sky. Everything was in disrepair. Of course, he thought, the Lord wants me to repair this church. He did not yet understand that God was speaking of something far greater, not a building of stone, but an entire spiritual edifice, a church in need of hearts on fire, of witnesses who would live the gospel without compromise. But that understanding would come. For now, the first task was humble, literal, and immediate. And Francis threw himself into it with everything he had. He went to his father's cloth warehouse. He took bolts of expensive fabric and rode to the nearby city of Foligno, where he sold them. He also sold his horse. And he returned to San Damiano with the money, offering it to the old priest who tended the chapel. The priest, baffled and a little alarmed by the wild-eyed merchant's son arriving with a pouch of coins, hesitated to accept. What Francis had not anticipated was his father's reaction. Pietro di Bernardone was furious. His son had stolen from him. There was no other word for it. He had taken valuable inventory without permission and sold it for money he had then given away. Pietro had him brought home by force, locked him in a room, and confronted him with the full weight of a father's rage and a merchant's wounded pride. But Francis would not yield. He had heard a voice. He had felt something shift at a level deeper than reason. No argument, no anger, no threat of disinheritance could undo what had happened inside him. The conflict between father and son came to a head before the Bishop of Assisi. Pietro demanded his son either return the money or renounce his inheritance. And Francis, in a gesture so dramatic, so absolute, so charged with symbolic power that it would be retold for centuries, did something neither his father nor anyone else in that courtroom expected. He took off his clothes, every last garment. He folded them neatly and placed them at his father's feet. And standing there, barefoot and bare before the assembly, he said quietly, "Until now I have called Pietro di Bernardone my father, but from this day forward I have only one Father, who is in heaven." The bishop stepped forward and wrapped his own cloak around the young man's bare shoulders. And Francis of Assisi walked out of that courtroom into a new life, owning nothing, belonging to no one, free in a way the world had no category for. You are not alone in this darkness, if tonight you are carrying the weight of a broken relationship, a bond that once held you and now wounds you, a love that has become a source of pain rather than shelter. Francis, too, stood in that rupture. He felt it. He chose it. And on the other side of that desolate threshold, he found something he had been searching for through every feast, every dream of glory, every restless night in prison. He found a peace that nothing and no one could take from him. The night deepens now. Let peace enfold you. The story continues. Rebuilding churches, building brotherhood. His conversion was complete. Francis now had nothing but a rough tunic someone had given him, and he threw himself into the task he believed God had entrusted to him, repairing the little church of San Damiano. But how? He had no money, no tools, no knowledge of masonry. What he did have was his old gift, that natural ability to move hearts that had once made him the king of every gathering in Assisi. And so he began to beg. He walked through the streets of Assisi, singing in French, asking for stones. Whoever gives me 1 stone will receive 1 reward. Whoever gives me 2 will receive 2. Whoever gives me 3 will receive 3. Some people were moved. Others were simply amused by the sight of the former prince of Assisi's youth, now a joyful beggar asking for rubble. Either way, they gave. And with those stones, with his own hands, Francis began to rebuild San Damiano, stone upon stone. Mortar mixed with bare hands, beams raised with effort. It was hard physical work for a young man who had grown up in comfort, but Francis did it singing. Seeing in every stone he laid an act of love toward Christ. He asked not only for stones but for oil to keep the church lamps burning. And when he asked for food for himself, which cost him something because traces of his old pride still lingered, he did so with humility. The chroniclers tell us that once, when he was given a meal that repulsed him, he paused before eating and said quietly to himself, "For the love of Christ, who suffered far more for you upon the cross." And he ate. When San Damiano was restored, he moved on. He repaired another small ruined church, San Pietro, and then a third, the tiny chapel of Santa Maria degli Angeli, known as the Porziuncola, the little portion, hidden in the forest outside Assisi. This last chapel, small and silent in the woods, would become the most sacred place in all of Francis's world, the beating heart of the order that was about to be born. For several years, Francis lived mostly in solitude, praying for long hours, fasting frequently, always seeking to draw closer to God. He was still walking alone, a strange and solitary figure in the eyes of Assisi. Perhaps admirable, certainly unusual, but without companions. That changed on a February morning in the year 1208. Francis was at Mass in the Porziuncola. The priest read the Gospel of the day, the passage from Matthew where Jesus sends out his apostles. "Take no gold, nor silver, nor copper in your belts. Take no bag for the journey, nor 2 tunics, nor sandals, nor a staff. As you go, preach, saying, 'The kingdom of heaven is at hand.'" The words fell on Francis like sunlight through a window that had always been there, unseen. "This," he said after Mass, his voice trembling with recognition, "this is what I want. This is what I seek. This is what I desire with my whole heart." He finally understood his vocation, not merely repairing churches of stone, but living the gospel to the letter, in radical poverty, in constant movement, in the simple proclamation of God's love. He laid aside his walking staff. He took off his sandals. He exchanged his belt for a length of rope. And barefoot, in that rough tunic tied with cord, he went out into the streets of Assisi and began to preach. His preaching was unlike anything the people had heard. He did not quote long passages of Latin that no one understood. He did not speak of complicated theology. He spoke of love, of peace, of repentance not as duty, but as the turning of a heart toward warmth. And above all, what he preached he lived, with a consistency between word and life so absolute that it moved people at a depth that arguments never reach. Soon men began to come. The first was Bernard of Quintaval, one of the wealthiest and most respected men in Assisi. Bernard had been watching Francis for months, intrigued by the transformation. One evening, he invited Francis to stay the night in his home and pretended to fall asleep, but lay awake watching. He saw Francis spend the entire night in prayer, repeating again and again, with tears and with joy, my God and my all, what are you and what am I?" In the morning, Bernard told him, "Brother, I have decided to leave everything and follow Christ with you." Francis suggested they go to church and open the gospel 3 times at random, letting Christ himself show them the way. 3 times the gospel spoke of radical detachment, of leaving everything to follow. Bernard sold all he possessed and distributed the money to the poor. The scene caused a sensation in Assisi. If a man like Bernard, mature, sensible, prosperous, followed Francis, perhaps the madman was not quite so mad after all. Pietro Catani joined them, a cathedral canon, a learned and devout man. Then Giles, a simple farmer with a pure heart. And then others, one by one, until within a few months, Francis had 11 companions. They lived together at the Poziuncola, in small shelters of branches and clay. They divided their days between prayer and going out 2 by 2 to preach in the surrounding villages, working with their hands wherever they could, helping in the fields, serving in the leper colonies, carrying out humble tasks. Francis insisted they should work before asking for alms, and when they did ask, they did so with joy, considering it a privilege to share, in some small way, the condition of Christ, who, being rich, chose to become poor. The life of these first brothers was one of radical simplicity, and yet anyone who saw them could not help but notice their joy. They called themselves the Lesser Brothers, the Friars Minor, because they wished to be beneath everyone, the servants of all. If they encountered a priest, however imperfect in his personal life, they were to honor him for the sacrament he carried. If they met a wise man, they were to honor his wisdom without envy. If they met a poor man, they were to see Christ himself in him. Francis would say that sadness was the devil's sickness, that the enemy rejoiced whenever he could extinguish the joy of a servant of God, because sorrow darkened the soul and made it heavy with itself. But when the heart was full of spiritual gladness, he said, the devil could find no entrance. And so these men, poor, fasting, sleeping on the ground, walking barefoot over stony paths, were known above all things for a joy that was impossible to explain by any worldly measure. And in that inexplicable joy, the world began, slowly, to take notice. The journey to Rome and the Pope's dream. By the year 1209, the group had grown to 12 brothers, and Francis felt the time had come to seek the blessing of the Church. He loved the Church deeply, not blindly, not without awareness of her human failures, but with a son's love, the kind that does not require perfection to remain faithful. It never occurred to him to stand apart, to build a movement outside her walls. He wanted his small fraternity to be officially recognized, sheltered under the authority of the Pope. And so Francis and his 12 companions set out on foot for Rome. They walked barefoot, the 150 miles or more that separated Assisi from the Eternal City, arriving dusty and weary in their mended habits, but with hearts full of hope. Rome at that moment was a center of intense ecclesiastical energy. Pope Innocent III was one of the most powerful pontiffs in history, a man of formidable intelligence, political acumen, and genuine Christian faith, who had spent his papacy consolidating the Church's authority and confronting the wave of heretical movements spreading across Europe. Getting an audience with him was no simple matter for a group of unknown poor pilgrims. But Francis had an unexpected ally. The Bishop of Assisi, Guido, had given them letters of introduction to Cardinal John of St. Paul, an influential voice in the Roman Curia, known for the holiness of his personal life. The cardinal, upon hearing Francis and seeing the clarity of his intentions, agreed to present him to the Pope. Not everyone in the papal court was persuaded. When Francis presented his rule, which was essentially a commitment to live the gospel to the letter in absolute poverty, several cardinals shook their heads. "Brother, your way of life seems to us too harsh and demanding. Without any possessions, I do not see how you could survive." Another added, "We have seen movements of poverty before, and many have ended in heresy. Absolute poverty is a beautiful ideal, but impossible to live. Men are weak, They need material security. Francis listened to these objections with humility, but in his heart, he knew with a quiet certainty that what he proposed was not impossible, because Christ himself had lived it and had asked it of his apostles. Cardinal John of St. Paul spoke in his defense. If we reject this rule as too difficult, we are saying that the gospel itself is impossible to live, and that would be to deny the grace of Christ. Pope Innocent III listened in silence. He was a careful man, accustomed to the complexities of power. But he was also a sincere Christian, genuinely troubled by the need for reform in the church. And the night before, he had been visited by a strange dream. In it, he saw the great basilica of St. John Lateran, the cathedral of the popes, swaying on the verge of collapse. And a small man, poorly dressed, was holding it up with his shoulders, keeping it from falling. When he saw Francis before him, slight in stature, dressed in his poor habit, radiating a quiet certainty that had nothing to do with worldly confidence, something stirred in the depths of Innocent's memory. Could this be the man from the dream? Could this small, joyful movement of gospel poverty be what the church needed for her renewal, rather than yet another source of division? After deliberating with his cardinals, Innocent made his decision. He would not grant a formal written approval. That would require a longer and more complex process. But he would give his verbal blessing to Francis's project. He would allow them to preach repentance, provided they did so in full communion with the Church. Francis and his brothers knelt before the Pope, who laid his hands upon them and blessed them. They left Rome singing. Their small fraternity had been recognized. They were officially the Friars Minor, lesser brothers, with the blessing of the Church to live their evangelical calling. The return to Assisi carried no worldly triumph, no crowds waiting, no banners, only the quiet, luminous certainty in their hearts that they were walking the right road. Word of the papal blessing spread quickly. Soon more men arrived, not only from Assisi, but from all across Umbria, and then from all of Italy. Nobles renouncing titles, knights laying down their swords, university students leaving their books, merchants distributing their goods and joining the barefooted brotherhood, each one drawn by something they had seen in the life of these men, a freedom, a joy, an unmistakable fragrance of the gospel lived without compromise. Francis understood that they needed to organize. He divided the Italian territory into regions, each with a minister, a servant, not a superior, to look after the brothers of each area. He himself refused the title of abbot, of superior, of anything that placed him above the others. He was simply Brother Francis, the least among the lesser. Each year at Pentecost, hundreds of brothers would gather at the Porziuncola for the general chapter, seated on the ground around that small chapel in the forest, sharing a simple meal, singing praises, listening to Francis speak of the love of God. A chronicler who attended one of these chapters wrote that the atmosphere of peace and joy was such that it seemed like a foretaste of heaven. These men had nothing, and yet, precisely because of that, they seemed to be the freest and most joyful men in the world. St. Clare and the courage of the Second Order. But the story of Francis would not be complete without speaking of Clare. Clare was of the Offreduccio family, one of the most noble in Assisi. She was beautiful, educated, sought after by young men of rank whose families saw in her an excellent match. A favorable marriage had already been arranged for, but Clare carried something else in her heart. She had heard Francis preach in the Cathedral of Assisi. She had watched the testimony of his life from a distance, and something in her recognized it. The way we recognize sometimes the thing we have been waiting for without knowing it. In secret from her family, she began to meet with Francis, seeking his counsel about her calling. Francis, moving carefully, connected her with other trusted priests. All of them confirmed what Francis had already sensed. Her vocation was genuine. On the night of Palm Sunday, in the year 1212, Clare was 18 years old. During the cathedral ceremony, when all the young noblewomen rose to receive their palm branches, Clare remained in her place, still, as if held to the ground by the weight of what she was about to do. The bishop, who knew her plans, descended the steps and personally placed the palm in her hands. It was a silent benediction, a wordless blessing for what the night would bring. That night, Claire fled. She had to remove the wooden barricades from a side door rarely used, the door of the dead, through which coffins were carried. Under the light of the moon, she ran through the streets of Assisi, down the hill, through the sleeping olive groves, until she reached the Porziuncola, where Francis and his brothers were waiting with lit torches. There, in that small chapel in the forest, Claire knelt before the altar. Francis cut her long blonde hair, the beauty that had been her family's pride. He placed a rough habit over her shoulders, and Claire made her vows, consecrating herself to God in poverty, chastity, and obedience. Because she could not remain with the brothers, Francis took her to a nearby Benedictine convent for temporary shelter. When her family discovered her flight, they arrived in fury, her uncles and brothers demanding her return, attempting to take her by force. But Claire held fast to the altar, pulled back the veil from her head to show her shorn hair, and told them quietly and firmly that her decision was made and that nothing would change it. They withdrew, defeated. Not long after, her younger sister Agnes, only 15, also fled to join her. This time the family came with greater force. The legend tells us that when they tried to drag young Agnes from the convent, her body became so heavy that 12 men together could not lift her from the floor. Francis eventually settled Claire, Agnes, and the other women who had come to join them at San Damiano, the first church he had ever repaired. A small convent was built beside it, and there Claire would live for the rest of her life, more than 40 years, never leaving those. It might seem from the outside like a life of sorrowful confinement, but nothing could be further from the truth. Claire was happy with a happiness that radiated from her like warmth from a quiet flame. She and her sisters lived in an even more radical poverty than the Friars, because they did not go out to beg or to work in the... They depended entirely on providence, on what the brothers and occasional benefactors brought to their door, and they accepted whatever came with equal peace, whether abundance or nothing. Claire insisted on being the servant of all. She herself washed the feet of sisters returning from their errands. She personally cared for the sick, without flinching from the most difficult task. She spent long hours in prayer, especially at night when the others slept. And often her sisters, waking before dawn, would find her still kneeling, wrapped in a silence deeper than sleep. Francis visited San Damiano when he could. He preached to the sisters, guided them, shared with them his vision of what it meant to live the gospel with empty hands and a full heart. The friendship between Francis and Claire was one of extraordinary purity and depth, a perfect spiritual companionship in which each helped the other toward holiness without any shadow of possession or need, each one freely given, freely held. There is a story that the sisters of San Damiano once convinced Francis to share a meal with Claire because they had not seen each other in a long time. Francis agreed, but insisted it be held at the Porziuncola, seated on the ground as the brothers always ate. During the meal, as Francis spoke of God with his characteristic fervor, something began to happen. A radiance entered the small gathering. Francis was lifted in ecstasy, Claire beside him. One by one, all those present were carried up into something that had no words. The peasants in the nearby fields saw a glow over the forest and thought the trees were burning. They came running with water and found everyone seated on the ground in profound, unbroken silence. The forest was not on fire, only the hearts inside it. Claire would go on to become the first woman in the history of the church to write a rule for religious women, and to fight for it with a tenacity that astonished cardinals and popes alike. For years, she battled against ecclesiastical officials who wanted the sisters to have property, endowments, material security, the very things she had renounced as the center of her vocation. She called the right to absolute poverty the privilege of poverty, and she would not surrender it. 2 days before her death, she finally received papal approval of her rule, the rule she had spent her life defending. She held the document in her failing hands, and those who were present say she looked at it a long time, in silence, and then looked up and said simply, "I give you thanks, Lord, for having created me." The night deepens, sleep draws near. The story continues, preaching to the birds and the love of all creation. Meanwhile, Francis and his brothers were carrying the gospel everywhere. They were no longer contained within the hills of Umbria. The brothers spread throughout all of Italy, then crossed the Alps into France, Germany, and Spain. Some set out for the mission lands, into Muslim territories, risking their lives to bring Christ to those who had never heard his name. The small fraternity, born in the forest outside Assisi, had become, in an astonishingly short time, a flame burning across the known world. Francis's preaching was unlike anything his age had produced. He was not an erudite theologian who quoted the church fathers and drew on philosophical argument. In fact, he held a certain gentle suspicion of excessive learning, fearing that knowledge, accumulated without love, could quietly inflate the very pride it claimed to oppose. He trusted instead the wisdom of the heart, the kind that comes from long hours of prayer, from tears, from the simple experience of being loved by God and loving in return. When he preached, he used images that a farmer or a fisherman could hold in their hands. He spoke of God as the shepherd who walks out into the dark to find one lost sheep, as the father who stands at the gate watching the road day after day until the wayward son appears on the horizon, as the sower who scatters his seed with a generosity that makes no practical sense, throwing it over rocky ground and thorn and path, as well as the good soil, because love does not calculate its giving. He spoke of the crucified Christ with such intensity that he often wept, and his weeping was contagious. It spread through crowds the way warmth spreads through a cold room, silently, until everyone in it has changed without quite knowing when it happened. Because for Francis, Christ was not an abstract theological principle. He was his beloved Lord, his older brother, his dearest friend. And when Francis remembered those wounds, that thirst on the cross, the cry of abandonment, he suffered with him. And when he spoke of the resurrection, his face became something that no artist ever quite managed to capture. His sermons were rarely long. They sprang directly from what the Holy Spirit placed in his heart in that moment. Brief, spontaneous, landing in the soul rather than in the... He might simply begin, "Brothers and sisters, do penance," and develop it from there, but always in a way that made people feel not the weight of obligation, but the warmth of invitation. God calling them not out of fear, but out of love. He did unexpected things to draw attention. Once, in a city where the crowds were noisy and distracted, he began to preach to the swallows darting and chattering overhead. "Sister swallows," he said, looking up, "you have spoken long enough. Now it is my turn. Listen to the word of God and be still until I have finished." And the swallows, the chronicle tells us, fell silent and remained silent until Francis had finished preaching. Only then did they rise again, singing. But it is the sermon to the birds that has become, perhaps, the most tenderly remembered moment in all of his life. Francis and some companions were traveling when he saw a great multitude of birds gathered in a field. Birds of many different kinds, all together, as if they had been waiting. He felt the impulse, as he often did, to respond to what the Spirit placed in him. He told his companions to wait, crossed the field, and walked among the birds. To his wonder, they did not scatter. They stayed. He preached to them. "My brothers the birds, you owe great praise to your Creator. He has given you feathers for clothing, wings for flight, and everything you need. He has made you noble among his creatures, and has given you the pure air as your dwelling. You do not sow, you do not reap, yet he feeds you. He gives you rivers and springs for your thirst, mountains and valleys for your shelter, and tall trees in which to build your nests. Though you neither spin nor weave, he clothes you and your children. He must love you very much to have given you so many good gifts." The birds, according to those present, stretched their wings, extended their necks, and gazed at Francis with a stillness that had no natural explanation. When he finished and blessed them with the sign of the cross, They rose all at once into the air, in the shape of a cross, singing before dispersing in the 4 directions of the earth. Francis wept after. He turned to his companions and said, "I accuse myself of grave sin, for I have never preached to my brothers the birds before, though they listened to the word of God with such reverence." From that day, he greeted every creature he encountered on the roads. He spoke to them. He blessed them. He would buy lambs being led to slaughter when he had the means, or simply stand and speak to the merchant until the man gave the animal away, shaking his head at the strange friar who seemed incapable of walking past suffering without doing something about it. He moved earthworms from the path so that no one would step on them. He freed a rabbit from a trap, only to find the rabbit unwilling to leave him, pressing against his habit, and he had to carry it to the edge of the forest and gently, laughingly plead with it to return to its own life. This tenderness toward creation was not sentiment. It rose from something theologically deep and quietly radical. Francis saw all creation as a book in which the goodness and beauty of God could be read. Every creature a word of God, a reflection of his boundless creativity, a reason to give praise. The sun was his elder brother, the moon his sister, water his sister, fire his brother. The animals were his younger siblings, worthy of respect and care, and there is something worth sitting with in the quiet of this night. In his radical poverty, owning nothing, holding nothing, Francis could relate to all things as a brother, not as an owner who uses and discards, not as someone who needs the world to give him security or status. He was free to simply love it. Perhaps you too have found, in moments when you let go of needing things to be a certain way, that the world becomes more beautiful, not less. That when the grip loosens, something opens. Rest now in that thought. Let it settle. The night deepened. The encounter with the Sultan and the weight of the order. In the year 1219, Francis made a decision that many considered the greatest foolishness of his life, which, given his history, was saying something. He decided to travel to Egypt. The Fifth Crusade was at its height. Christian armies were gathered along the Nile Delta, besieging the city of Damietta. The air was thick with the weight of war, violence, strategy, bloodshed, the grinding machinery of holy conflict that had lost much of its holiness somewhere along the way. Francis had seen the consequences of that violence. His heart had suffered over it. He believed, with a conviction that came from somewhere beyond argument, that there was another way, the way of peaceful witness, of a word that persuades through love rather than compels through force. So he crossed the sea with a single companion, Brother Illuminato, and arrived at the Crusader camp. Cardinal Pelagius, who commanded the Christian forces, warned Francis in the plainest possible terms that attempting to cross enemy lines was not foolishness, but suicide. Francis listened respectfully and went anyway. He and Brother Illuminato walked directly into the Muslim camp. They were seized immediately by guards, beaten, bound. But Francis only repeated one word, over and over. Sultan, Sultan. He wanted to be taken to the leader. The guards, puzzled by these two unarmed, unafraid, strangely peaceful men, decided to bring them before Sultan al-Kamil, rather than simply kill them. Sultan al-Kamil was a cultivated man, intelligent, relatively measured, curious about the world he governed. When he saw these two poor religious men, bearing no weapons, asking nothing, appearing to fear death not at all, he was genuinely curious. He asked what they wanted. Francis replied that they had come to speak with him about the Christian faith, about the love of God made visible in Jesus Christ. What followed was something the age could barely contain. For several days, Francis remained in the Sultan's tent in conversation. He did not preach with arrogance or condescension. He spoke with humility and deep respect for the man before him, yet without softening or compromising a single word of what he believed. He was simply himself, transparent, warm, unafraid, alive with a love he could not conceal. The Sultan offered him gifts, gold, precious silks. Francis declined them all, accepting only a small ivory horn that he would later use to call his brothers to prayer. The Sultan, moved in ways he may not have fully understood himself, gave Francis a safe conduct to visit the holy sites of Jerusalem freely, an extraordinary privilege in the middle of a war. He sent him back to the Christian camp with honor. Later, some of the Sultan's advisors asked why he had not simply had these Christians executed as the law permitted. Al-Kamil replied, "Those men are not like the other Christians. They do not come with swords. They come with peace. They do not come to conquer. They come to bear witness. I cannot kill a saint." Francis returned to Italy carrying that ivory horn, and something else, a quiet sorrow perhaps, at how rarely the cross is offered to the world in the spirit of the one who died upon it. He had shown in that tent by the Nile what Christian mission could look like, not conquest, but encounter, not dominance, but the simple, vulnerable offering of love. But when he arrived back in Italy, he found the order in the grip of a different kind of struggle. The fraternity had grown enormously in his absence. There were now thousands of brothers, and with the growth had come tensions that no amount of spiritual fervor could fully dissolve. Some of the more educated brothers, men who had joined from universities and established religious communities, wanted to modify the rule. They wanted the brothers to be permitted to own books for study, adequate buildings for community life, storerooms for provision. They wanted, in short, to make the rule reasonable. Francis resisted with everything in him. For him, poverty was not a secondary detail that could be negotiated according to circumstance. It was the very heart of what they were called to be. "Poverty is Our Lady," he said, "the bride of the order, the source of their freedom, the thing that kept them near the Christ who was born in a stable and died owning nothing but the wounds on his body." Without poverty, they would become, in time, simply another institution. Respectable, perhaps even admirable, but no longer the living provocation they were meant to be. The pressure came not only from within the order, but from well-meaning cardinals and bishops who found absolute poverty admirable in principle and impractical at scale. They wanted to moderate it, to institutionalize it, to make it workable for thousands. Francis suffered deeply in these years. Not dramatically, not bitterly, but with the quiet, patient ache of a man who sees the thing he loves being gradually reshaped by forces he cannot stop. He had never wanted to found a great order with thousands of members and complex structures. He had simply wanted to live the gospel with a few brothers, joyfully, simply, close to the poor and to the earth. In the midst of these struggles, he withdrew. He needed to return to the source, to seek, in silence, what God was asking of him now. He climbed to a place called Mount Verna, a wild and rocky peak in the Apennines, donated years before by a nobleman for the brothers to use as a place of prayer and retreat. What happened there would mark the final chapter of his earthly life. The miracle at Mount Verna, the stigmata. It was September of the year 1224. Francis was 42 years old, but his body carried far more years than that. Decades of fasting, of sleeping outdoors, of walking barefoot over stone and mud, of illnesses left untreated out of a poverty that extended even to medical care. All of it had worn the body down to something lean and fragile, like a candle that has been burning a long time. He climbed Mount Verna, accompanied by only a few trusted brothers, among them Brother Leo, his secretary, his confidant, the man who knew him perhaps more deeply than anyone. Francis found a cleft in the rock near the summit, a hidden hollow where he could be entirely alone, and he asked his companions not to disturb him, only to bring him a little bread and water once each day. He intended to spend 40 days in fasting and prayer, preparing for the feast of the Archangel Michael. And for 40 days, he descended into a silence that went beyond silence, into that place within the self where only God remains. He meditated ceaselessly on the passion of Christ. He asked for two graces. The first, to feel in his own heart the love that had moved Christ to suffer so much for us. The second, to feel in his own body, as far as God would permit, the pain Christ had experienced in his passion. On the 14th of September, the feast of the exaltation of the Holy Cross, Francis was deep in prayer at dawn, absorbed beyond thought, when he saw a figure descending toward him through the light. It was a seraph, an angel of the highest order, bearing 6 wings, and between those radiant wings appeared the figure of the crucified Christ. The vision filled Francis's soul with something he had no words for, an indescribable mixture of joy and pain. Joy from the closeness to Christ, pain from the suffering of Christ. His heart burned with a love so intense that he thought it would consume him entirely. When the vision faded, he looked down, on his hands, on his feet, in the exact places where Christ had been nailed to the cross. The marks of the nails had appeared. Not faint marks, not wounds of the skin, but protrusions of flesh, hard as iron, dark in color, passing completely through his hands and feet as if the nails were still there. On his right side, a wound opened like a lance's mark, from which blood flowed freely. Francis was terrified. He was astonished, and he was filled with a gratitude so enormous it had no form. He tried immediately to hide the wounds. He bandaged his hands and feet, wrapped himself carefully, because the last thing he wanted was to be seen as someone extraordinary, someone set apart. But concealment was impossible. When his habit was washed, the blood was visible. When the brothers cared for him, because the wounds caused him constant pain, they could not help but see. Brother Leo was the first witness. He stood in silence before his father Francis, and the chronicle tells us he could not speak. He simply wept. The stigmata, as these mystical wounds would be called, were a gift, but they were also a heavy cross. Each step he took was painful, because the formations on his feet made walking a slow and tender suffering. The wounds bled regularly, staining his bandages, requiring constant care. His eyesight, already damaged by illness, grew worse in those final years, and even lamplight could cause him pain. And yet Francis never complained. He considered these wounds the greatest gift God had ever given him, the grace of participating, in some small and unworthy way, in the redemptive suffering of Christ. He was the first documented person in Christian history to receive the stigmata. And it was not something he had sought out of a desire for mystical distinction. It was the natural consequence of a love so total, so sustained, so completely directed toward the crucified Christ, that the body itself, in the end, could not remain untouched. When he descended from Mount Verna, Francis was a changed man, not only in body, though the wounds were real and visible and painful, but in something that the brothers around him recognized without being able to name. He had always been joyful, but now his joy was threaded through with a mystical ache, a longing for heaven, a burning desire to be entirely with Christ. He still found beauty in the world. He still laughed. He still greeted the sun in the morning as his elder brother. But part of him was no longer fully here. He lived in those final years as a man who has one foot on the earth and the other already resting in eternity. Perhaps you too know what it is to carry something in your body that reminds you every single day of your own fragility, a pain that will not leave, an ache you have learned to move around, to carry gently, to offer up. If so, rest now in the company of Francis, who carried his wounds not as a burden, but as a love letter written in flesh, who found, in the very place of his greatest suffering, his greatest peace. You are not alone in this darkness. The night deepens. Let peace enfold you. The Canticle of the creatures. Light in the darkness. In the midst of all that suffering, Francis composed one of the most beautiful jewels in all of spiritual literature, the Canticle of the creatures, also known as the Canticle of Brother Sun. And to truly receive it, we need to understand when it was written. Francis's eyes were nearly gone. Years of weeping in prayer, of exposure to the fierce Italian sun during his travels, of penances that gave no quarter to the body, all of it had severely damaged his sight. The pain in his eyes was so intense that he often could not sleep. Physicians tried to treat him with cauterizations, applying heated irons to his temples, a procedure that was as frightening as it sounds, and that Francis endured with a patience that left the doctors themselves quiet. He was nearly blind, in pain throughout his body, weak from fasting and illness. Anyone would have understood. Anyone would have forgiven. A descent into bitterness, into complaint, into the grey silence of despair. Francis did the opposite. In the middle of his suffering, in the darkness, quite literally, he composed a hymn of cosmic joy. The Canticle is written in the Umbrian dialect that Francis spoke, not in Latin. This was deliberate. He wanted ordinary people to understand it, to be able to sing it. And it is one of the first great literary texts in the Italian language. Its poetic beauty, extraordinary even apart from its spiritual depth. It opens like this: Most High, all-powerful, all good Lord, all praise is yours, all glory, all honor, and all blessings. To you alone, Most High, do they belong, and no human lips are worthy to pronounce your name. Be praised, my Lord, through all your creatures, especially through my Lord brother Sun, who brings the day, and through whom you give us light. He is beautiful and radiant in all his splendor, and bears a likeness of you, Most High. Be praised, my Lord, through Sister Moon and the stars. In the heavens you have made them bright, precious, and beautiful. Be praised, my Lord, through Brother Wind, and through the air, cloudy and clear, and every kind of weather, through which you give sustenance to your creatures. Be praised, my Lord, through Sister Water, who is so very useful and humble, precious and pure. Be praised, my Lord, through Brother Fire, through whom you brighten the night. He is beautiful, playful, robust, and strong. Each verse celebrates an element of creation, not as something impersonal or merely useful, but as a brother or sister. The Sun, an elder brother, radiant and powerful, bearing the likeness of God. The Moon, a sister, gentle and luminous alongside her companion stars. The Wind, a brother who brings change and life. The Water, a sister, humble and precious, without whom nothing lives. The Fire, a joyful, strong brother who turns the darkness into warmth. And the Earth, our mother, who holds us, feeds us, brings forth fruit and flowers, and the persistent green of things that endure. This is not simply a beautiful poem about nature. It is a vision, a deep theological seeing. Francis perceives all creation as a single family, gathered around one Father. Everything that exists reflects some aspect of the goodness and beauty of God. And everything exists not to be consumed or exploited, but to be received with gratitude and love. A love that carries us naturally, inevitably, back to the Creator who made it all. What moves the soul when we sit with this canticle is precisely its context. Francis wrote a hymn of cosmic joy from within great personal suffering. His eyes could barely see the sun he was praising. His feet ached with every step he took toward the earth he was thanking. His hands bled when they moved, and still he sang. This reveals something at the very core of the Franciscan spirit. Something worth holding gently tonight. Joy is not the absence of pain. It is not a mood that arrives when suffering departs. It is a disposition of the soul, a settled orientation of the heart that can coexist with pain, and that sometimes, mysteriously, burns most clearly in the dark. Later, Francis added more verses to the Canticle. One of the most moving came when he was confined to his bed in Assisi and learned that the bishop and the mayor of the city had fallen into bitter conflict, a quarrel that was dividing the community and causing real harm. Francis, too weak to rise and speak to them directly, composed a verse about forgiveness and sent brothers to sing the entire canticle before both men. Be praised, my Lord, through those who grant pardon for love of you, and who endure sickness and tribulation. Blessed are those who endure in peace, for by you, Most High, they shall be crowned. The beauty of the words, the image of the suffering Francis calling from his sickbed for reconciliation, broke through something in both men. The bishop and the mayor embraced each other publicly, to the joy of the entire city. And the final verse, the one Francis saved for last, composing it only when he knew his death was near, was about sister death. Be praised, my Lord, through our sister bodily death, from whom no living person can escape. Woe to those who die in mortal sin. Blessed are those whom death will find in your most holy will, for the second death shall do them no harm. To call death a sister was, in the world Francis inhabited, quietly revolutionary. The medieval mind feared death as the final enemy, the shadow that undoes every human plan. But Francis, standing at the threshold, looked at it differently. For one who has lived in the grace of God, death is not the enemy. She is the sister who opens the last door, who leads us home, who is simply the passage from the long hallway into the room where the light lives. The final via crucis and the embrace of Sister Death. The last 2 years of Francis's life were a slow, patient walking of the way of the cross. His body, which he had given so fully and for so long, was now giving way. In addition to the stigmata and the near blindness, a disease of the liver brought constant pain and burning fever. His stomach, ravaged by years of fasting, could barely receive food. He was carried from city to city as the brothers sought physicians who might help him, and the treatments, primitive, often painful, sometimes more damaging than the illness itself, brought little relief. Before one of the cauterizations, when the physicians prepared to apply heated iron to his temples, Francis looked at the brazier and spoke to the fire with that characteristic tenderness that never left him, even at the end. Brother Fire, the Most High has made you strong and beautiful and useful. I have always loved you, and I will continue to love you for the sake of Him who created you. I beg you now, be courteous to me in this hour. Burn me gently. The brothers who accompanied him fled the room when the iron was applied. They could not watch. When they crept back in, Francis was smiling. Cowards, he said gently. Why did you run? I tell you, I felt no pain. I felt nothing. The physicians who examined him afterwards said they did not understand it. But those who knew Francis did not wonder long. He had spent his entire life learning to receive. He had simply extended that practice to this. Despite all the treatments, Francis did not improve. He worsened slowly, steadily, with a kind of grace, as if the body were simply completing what it had always been doing, yielding, releasing, making room for what was coming. When he understood that his death was approaching, he did not resist it. He asked to be taken back to Assisi, to his city, to the place where everything had begun. The journey was difficult. They carried him on a stretcher, because walking was no longer possible. Every movement caused him pain. But when the walls of Assisi appeared in the distance, those ancient stone walls he had walked outside as a young man in his fine clothes, singing troubadour songs, Francis asked to be helped upright. He looked toward the city for a long moment, and he blessed it, slowly, carefully, with his bandaged hands, praying for every soul within those walls, for those who had followed him and for those who had laughed at him, for the rich and for the poor. The brothers wanted to take him to the convent in the city, to a proper bed and proper care. But Francis asked to be carried to the Porziuncola, that small chapel in the forest where everything had truly begun, 46 years before. He wanted to die there. They settled him in a small shelter beside the chapel. There, surrounded by the brothers dearest to him, Francis spent his final weeks. His body was devastated, but his spirit remained, as it always had, inexplicably lit from within. He continued to give counsel. He continued, in a voice that grew quieter by the day, to speak of the importance of living the gospel in poverty and joy. And he continued, when he had breath for it, to sing. Claire and her sisters at San Damiano sent messengers every day asking news of him. Claire herself was gravely ill, and she suffered with the thought that she might never see her spiritual father again in this life. Francis sent her a letter. We do not have the exact words, but those who knew him said it was tender and clear, assuring her that they would meet again in the place where all meetings are final and all partings are forgotten. In those last days, Francis called all the brothers who could reach him to come. He wanted to speak to them once more. Though barely able to sit, he spoke with his old passion, reminding them of their lady poverty, warning them against the quiet pride that hides inside learning, urging them above all to love one another, to remain always the least, the servants of all. He spoke of the Eucharist with a tenderness that moved every man in the room. He had always said that if he met a saint descended from heaven and a poor priest walking the same road, he would greet the priest first, because the priest's hands had touched the body of Christ. He dictated his testament, a document of luminous simplicity, tracing the whole arc of his life from the first encounter with the leper on the road outside Assisi to the grace of the gospel he had tried to live without compromise or softening. He asked his brothers simply to take the rule as it was and live it, not to interpret it, not to explain it away, not to smooth its edges into something more comfortable, because the rule was the gospel itself, and the gospel needed no improvement. On his last night, Francis asked to be taken from his bed and laid directly on the bare earth. He wanted to die as he had lived, without anything between himself and the mother he had always loved, the poor earth, that sister of the poor Christ. The brothers, weeping, lowered him gently to the ground. He lay there with his arms spread wide, in the shape of a cross. He asked that the passage from the Gospel of John be read to him, the account of the Last Supper, where Jesus washes the feet of his disciples and gives them the new commandment of love. As it was read, those present could see Francis's lips moving, whispering the words alongside the reader, as if printing them one final time into the deepest part of his heart. When the reading ended, Francis asked for bread. It was brought to him. With hands that could barely move, he blessed it, broke it, and passed a piece to each brother present. An echo of the Last Supper, a final act of the love that had defined his entire life. Then, in a voice unexpectedly clear for someone so weak, he began the last verse of his Canticle, the verse about Sister Death. One by one, the brothers joined him, singing through their tears in the small shelter in the forest, "Be praised, my Lord, through our sister bodily death." Outside, the birds that had been silent all that day began suddenly to sing. A flock of larks, Francis's beloved larks, the birds that sing at dawn, at the threshold between darkness and light, descended on the roof of the shelter, circling and singing joyfully, though it was already the hour of evening when larks fall quiet. Francis heard them. He smiled. He whispered, "Welcome, Sister Death." And then, softly, without struggle, without anguish, simply and completely, he stopped breathing. His face held an expression of such profound peace that the brothers who witnessed it said afterward that it was the most beautiful face they had ever seen. The transit, the stigmata revealed, and the first miracles. It was the evening of the 3rd of October in the year 1226. Francis was 44 or 45 years old. For a moment, the brothers simply remained in silence, unable to move. Their father was gone. The room felt both emptied and full at the same time, emptied of his voice, his breath, the small sounds of his presence, and yet full of something that had no name, something that pressed gently against the walls of the little shelter and asked not to be forgotten. Then Brother Leo stepped forward and drew back the cloth that covered Francis's body, and what they saw stopped every breath in the room. The stigmata, those wounds that Francis had hidden with such care, bandaged and wrapped and concealed from every curious eye for the 2 years since Verna, were there, fully visible now, unmistakable. The marks in his hands and feet, the wound in his side, the formations of dark flesh where the nails of Christ had passed through. Every brother in that room fell to his knees. They wept, and they sang the great hymn of thanksgiving, the Te Deum, rising up through the wooden walls of the shelter and into the night sky above the Porziuncola forest, where the larks were still circling overhead in the dark, singing. The news spread through Assisi like morning light, quietly at first, then everywhere at once. People came in waves to the Porziuncola. They came weeping, yes, but not only in grief. There was something else in their faces, something lit from inside. Because everyone who had known Francis, even those who had once called him a fool, even those who had shaken their heads at the merchant's son who gave everything away, understood now, with a certainty no argument could shake, that they had been living alongside a saint. Francis's body was carried in solemn procession from the Porziuncola to Assisi. Thousands joined the slow procession through the countryside and up the hill, singing, weeping, pressing close to the wooden bier, touching it with cloths and rosary beads to carry something of him home. The procession stopped at San Damiano so that Claire and her sisters might say farewell. Claire came out of her enclosure for the first time in decades. She stood over the body of her spiritual father. She took his bandaged hands in hers and kissed the wounds of the stigmata. Her tears were silent. Then she straightened, turned to her sisters, and said quietly, "Go in peace. Our Father has gone ahead, but he will pray for us from heaven, and I will not be long in joining him." She lived 27 more years, but those who knew her said that from that day, she walked always with one eye looking upward, already more than half in love with the place she was going. Francis was buried temporarily in the church of San Giorgio in Assisi, while the great basilica being planned for him was completed. And before the mortar of that first tomb had fully dried, the miracles began. The sick who touched the stone of his burial place were healed, some immediately, some over the days that followed. The blind recovered their sight. The paralyzed walked. Those tormented by inner darkness found it lifting. A knight of Assisi, who had been loudly skeptical of Francis's holiness, insisting that the man was simply an eccentric, a fond but harmless fool, was suddenly struck with paralysis. In his fear, in the long hours when he lay unable to move, something in him softened. He made a promise. If Francis interceded and he was healed, he would build a chapel in his honor. Movement returned to his limbs. He spent the rest of his life as a Franciscan tertiary, serving the poor. A woman who had suffered for years from tumors that no physician could treat dreamed that Francis stood beside her bed. In the dream, he touched the places of illness with his wounded hands and said simply, "Do not be afraid, you will be healed." She woke whole. The physicians who examined her afterward found nothing. A 4-year-old child fell into a deep well, more than 60 feet deep, far beyond any hope of rescue in time. His mother, frantic on the edge of the well, cried out, "Saint Francis, if you are truly a saint, save my son." When men descended with ropes, they found the child floating quietly at the surface, peaceful, unhurt. The boy said afterward that a man in a brown habit had been holding him up. These miracles, and hundreds like them, were carefully documented by the brothers and by the church's investigators. The process of canonization moved with unusual speed. On the 16th of July, 1228, barely 2 years after his death, Pope Gregory IX solemnized the canonization of Francis of Assisi before thousands gathered in the streets of his city. The Pope, who had known Francis personally and loved him, preached the canonization with tears visible on his face. He spoke of a man who had not written a theological treatise or governed a diocese or led an army, but who had simply looked at the gospel and decided without reservation to live it, and in doing so had renewed the church more profoundly than any institution could. A great basilica was constructed over his tomb, double-tiered, as if to hold two kinds of truth at once. The upper church, radiant with light, its walls covered in the magnificent frescoes of Giotto and his students, painting the life of Francis in images of luminous, almost unbearable beauty. The lower church, deep, dark, vaulted like a crypt, a space where the soul naturally quiets, where whispered prayers feel very close to being heard. And in the crypt below, in the deepest stillness of that ancient stone, the bones of Francis rest in their sarcophagus. When excavations rediscovered his tomb in 1818, nearly 600 years after his death, the skeleton was intact, still wrapped in the remains of his habit, and the bones of his hands and feet bore, unmistakably, the marks of the stigmata, perforations in the exact places where the nails of the crucified Christ had passed through. 6 centuries had not erased what love had written on that body. Sleep draws near now. The night is deep and still. Let peace enfold you. The story continues. The expansion of the family and the universal legacy. But the legacy of Francis is not contained in a basilica, however beautiful. His true legacy is the spiritual family born from his vision, a family that is still alive and still growing 800 years later. The First Order, the Friars Minor, eventually branched into several distinct families. The conventual Franciscans were among the first to settle into stable communities. The observant Franciscans arose in the 15th century, seeking a return to a stricter observance of the original rule. The Capuchins emerged in the 16th century with a renewed emphasis on radical poverty, contemplative solitude, and direct popular preaching. Across all these branches, tens of thousands of Franciscan friars now serve in every corner of the world. The Second Order, the Poor Clares, the Sisters of St. Clare, continues to flourish in cloistered convents in hundreds of cities. These women live the same life of prayer, poverty, and joy that Clare first embodied at San Damiano. Their hidden life is a treasure the world rarely sees, an underground river of grace, flowing silently but powerfully beneath the surface of everything. And then there is the Third Order, today called the Secular Franciscan Order, for lay people who wish to live the Franciscan spirit in the midst of the ordinary world. Married and single, workers and professionals, artists and teachers, millions of people across history have committed themselves to living according to Franciscan values: simplicity of life, love for creation, service to the poor, the pursuit of peace, and the daily cultivation of evangelical joy. Francis himself established this Third Order when men and women who could not leave their families and their work began coming to him, asking for a way to live his spirit without leaving the world. He called it the Order of Penance and gave them simple, livable guidelines: honesty in their dealings, moderation in their needs, regular prayer and fasting, a commitment to peace, and a generous care for the poor according to their means. This was a quietly revolutionary intuition. It democratized holiness in a sense, removed it from the monastery, and gave it back to the world. A carpenter, a mother, a merchant, a farmer, all could be saints by living their ordinary lives permeated with the spirit of the gospel. The path to perfection was not a place you had to go to. It was a way of being, available everywhere. What is it exactly about this Franciscan spirit that has moved so many hearts across so many centuries? What makes it speak to people of every era, every culture, every circumstance? First, there is the emphasis on evangelical poverty, not as an end in itself, but as a means to freedom and love. Francis understood, with a clarity that only experience can give, that our possessions possess us in return. The more we hold, the more we worry about protecting it, increasing it, and dreading its loss. Poverty liberates us from those chains. It allows us to travel lightly, with open hands, ready to receive whatever God places in them, with a heart unattached enough to love without calculation. But Franciscan poverty is not a bitter or resentful thing. It is not the poverty of someone who feels cheated by life. It is a joyful poverty, freely chosen for love, lived with gratitude for everything received as pure gift. The Franciscan does not say, "I have nothing." He says, "Everything is mine to enjoy and to give thanks for. I am poor in possessions and rich in being." Second is universal fraternity. Francis called not only his religious companions brother and sister, he extended that address to the sun, the water, the birds, the wolf on the road, and above all, to every human being, regardless of race, religion, social standing, or moral condition. This vision was not sentiment. It had radical practical consequences. It meant there could be no absolute enemies, that even the Muslim sultan was a brother to be approached with respect, that the leper was a brother who deserved an embrace, that the thief and the sinner were brothers in need of mercy, not condemnation. Third is joy as the mark of authentic Christian life. Francis insisted that sadness was a temptation of the enemy, that the true Christian must be joyful even in suffering, because they know they are loved by God, that everything has meaning even when meaning is hidden. and that the end of the story is glory. This Franciscan joy is not a performance or a denial. Francis wept, he suffered, he struggled. But even in the midst of all of that, a joy remained. Paradoxical, inexplicable, springing from a depth that pain could not reach. Fourth is passionate love for Christ, especially the crucified Christ. All of Franciscan spirituality flows from this personal, intimate love for Jesus. Francis did not love abstract ideas about God. He loved a person, the concrete, incarnate Word, poor and humble and tender, who stretched his arms wide on the cross and said, in the only language that leaves no room for misunderstanding, I love you this much. Fifth is the profound devotion to the Eucharist. In the Incarnation, Francis said, God became man, limiting himself to human form, taking on flesh. But in the Eucharist, he goes even further. He makes himself present under the humble appearances of bread and wine, allowing us to touch him, receive him, to be intimately united with him. When Francis entered even the smallest, most neglected church, he knelt immediately in adoration. Every Mass was, for him, Calvary and resurrection made present. Sixth is love for and obedience to the Church. Francis never stood apart, never pointed publicly at the failures of those in authority, never allowed the human imperfections of the institution to become a reason for separation. He chose the harder path, reform from within, through the testimony of life rather than the force of denunciation, through love rather than condemnation. He trusted that lived holiness is more powerful, in the end, than any written treatise. Seventh is the balance between contemplation and action, between the prayer that fills and the service that pours out. Francis was not a monk locked behind cloister walls, nor was he merely a social worker. He was a contemplative in action, someone who moved between long periods of deep solitude and intense periods of service, each feeding the other. The prayer gave meaning and strength to the service. The service kept the prayer rooted in the concrete reality of human need. Eighth is the spirit of peace and reconciliation. The characteristic greeting of Francis was, "The Lord give you peace." Not an empty formula, a mission. He believed that followers of Christ must be instruments of peace in a world divided by wars and accumulated grievances. This peace began in the depths of the soul, reconciled with God, and from there moved outward, into families, into cities, into the space between strangers. Ninth is the simplicity and accessibility of the message. Francis was not an academic theologian. He spoke the language of ordinary people, used images from daily life, taught through concrete examples rather than abstract theory. His message reached everyone, the illiterate farmer, the frightened woman, the child, the outcast who had never understood a word of the learned Latin sermons. This simplicity was not shallowness. It was depth made available. The gospel itself is like this. Infinite depths expressed in parables simple enough for a child to hold, and rich enough for a wise person to spend a lifetime exploring without exhausting. Tenth is warm humanity and a genuine sense of humor. Francis laughed. He made small, innocent jokes with his brothers to lighten the day. When he was ill and his spirit was low, he once asked a brother to mime playing a musical instrument to cheer him up. He invented games to keep the spirit of brotherhood alive. This humanity is not a footnote to his holiness. It is part of it. Holiness does not destroy the human person. It perfects it, freeing it to be, at last, what it was always meant to be. His influence moved quickly beyond religious circles. Giotto, the great painter of the late medieval period, devoted his genius to depicting the life of Francis in the frescoes of the Basilica of Assisi, images that would quietly revolutionize European art, replacing the flat Byzantine style with figures of volume and visible human emotion. Dante placed Francis in paradise and devoted one of the most beautiful cantos of the Divine Comedy to him, describing him as a rising sun that illuminated the world, an ardent lover who married poverty when everyone else had abandoned her. Over the centuries, Artists of every school, El Greco, Zurbarán, Caravaggio, created their own Francis, each age finding in him something that answered its own deepest question. Chesterton, in the 20th century, wrote a biography that is also a literary masterpiece, presenting Francis as the true revolutionary, the fool of God, the man who turned the world upside down precisely by refusing to stand on its terms. In more recent times, the Franciscan family has given the world men and women whose holiness continues to astonish. Maximilian Kolbe, the Polish Franciscan friar, who, in the Auschwitz concentration camp, stepped forward to die in place of a stranger, a father of a family. Padre Pio, the Capuchin who bore the stigmata for 50 years in the 20th century, whose confessional drew millions from across the world, and who is said to have read souls with the same quiet directness that Francis brought to every encounter. And when Jorge Mario Bergoglio was elected Pope in 2013, he chose the name Francis, the first Pope in history to do so. His first great encyclical, Laudato Si, Be Praised, takes its very title from the opening words of the Canticle of the Creatures. 800 years after Francis sang his hymn to Brother Sun in the darkness of his failing sight, the words echoed through the teaching office of the Church. Everything is connected. Everything is family. Everything calls us back to the Father. Stories of the soul. The Wolf of Gubbio, Perfect Joy, and the first nativity scene. Let me offer you now, before the night grows deeper still, some of the stories that bring Francis closest. The ones that show not the historical figure, but the man himself. There is the story of the Wolf of Gubbio. The city of Gubbio was living in terror. A large and fierce wolf had been attacking and killing both livestock and people. No one dared leave the city walls. Francis arrived in Gubbio, heard of the situation, and said simply, "Let me speak with Brother Wolf." The people thought he had completely lost his mind, but Francis walked out alone into the open countryside. When the wolf appeared, growling, moving with clear intent, Francis spoke to him. "Brother Wolf, come here. In the name of Christ, I command you not to harm me, nor anyone else." The wolf approached, slowly, and laid his head in Francis's hands. Francis addressed him with great seriousness, as he might address a person. "Brother Wolf, you have done great harm in this region. You have killed creatures of God without his permission. You deserve punishment as a thief and a murderer. But I wish to make peace between you and the people of this city, so that you may offend no more, and they may forgive you for what is past." The wolf, the chronicle tells us, bowed his head as if in agreement. Francis continued, "Brother Wolf, since you are willing to make this peace, I promise you that the people of this city will feed you every day for as long as you live, so that you will suffer no more from hunger. For I know well that it was hunger that drove you to all the harm you have done. Do I have your word that you will never again harm any human being or animal?" The wolf raised his right paw and placed it in Francis's hand. Francis led him back to the city. The people, initially frozen with fear, gradually gathered courage as they saw the wolf walking docilely beside Francis, like a large and somewhat sheepish companion. The pact was made publicly. The city would feed the wolf. The wolf would harm no one. And for 2 years, until the wolf died of old age, the arrangement held. He would go from house to house, door to door, and be fed. The children played with him without fear. When he finally died, the people of Gubbio mourned him as one of their own. Centuries later, excavations beneath a church in Gubbio uncovered the skeleton of a large wolf buried with evident reverence beneath the floor. Possibly, though no one can say with certainty, the famous wolf of St. Francis. Then there is the story of Francis and the lark, a simpler story, tender as a breath. Not long before his death, Francis was lying ill in his small shelter in Assisi. A lark descended onto the roof above him. Francis loved larks above all birds. They rise before dawn to sing their praises, and their brown hooded plumage, he always said, resembled a Franciscan habit. He looked up and said quietly, "Sister Lark, come and praise your Creator." The bird descended onto his hand. It seemed to bow. Francis stroked it gently. "Sing, sister. Praise the Lord your Creator with gladness." and the lark sang with such sweetness that Francis wept. The brothers who witnessed it said afterward that they understood, in that moment, that Francis would soon fly home. There are also stories with a lighter touch. Once, during a period of strict fasting, Francis woke in the night feeling faint and genuinely worried that he had pushed his body beyond what was reasonable. But rather than eat alone and in secret, which would have troubled him, he woke all the brothers, prepared food for everyone, and ate the midnight meal in community. He explained afterward that he had done it so that he would not have to be ashamed alone, and to teach them that penance should never be carried beyond what the body can reasonably bear. The care of a father, and the humour of a man who understood that holiness does not require heroism at every moment. And there is the story of perfect joy, one of the most famous of all Franciscan stories, told with deliberate humour and bottomless depth. One winter, Francis and Brother Leo were walking in the cold. To pass the time, Francis began a kind of theological game. Brother Leo, even if all the friars were to give the most shining examples of holiness in every land, write this down and note it carefully. Perfect joy is not there. They walked further. Francis continued, even if the friar minor were to give sight to the blind, straighten the crippled, cast out demons, raise the dead, even a man 4 days dead, write that perfect joy is not there. Leo, cold and confused, finally asked, Father, in the name of God, please tell me, where is perfect joy? Francis replied, when we arrive at the Porziuncola, soaked with rain, frozen with cold, covered in mud, tormented by hunger, and we knock on the door, and the porter comes out in a bad mood and says, who are you? And we say, we are 2 of your brothers. And he says, you lie. You are 2 rascals who go about deceiving the world. Get away from here. And he does not open to us, and leaves us standing outside in the snow and rain, cold and hungry until night. If we endure all of this patiently, without being troubled, without murmuring against him, believing humbly that this porter knows us well, and that it is God who makes him speak so against us. Oh, Brother Leo, write that here is perfect joy. And if we persist in knocking, and he comes out enraged and drives us away with blows, treating us like impostors and vagabonds, and we endure all of this with patience, thinking of the sufferings of the blessed Christ, and bear it all for love of him, with joy. Oh, Brother Leo, write that here and only here is perfect joy, because above all the graces and gifts of the Holy Spirit that Christ grants to his friends, above all of them, is this, to conquer oneself, and willingly, for love of Christ, to suffer pain, insults, reproaches, and hardship. That is the perfect and true joy. The story is funny in its exaggeration. It is also one of the most exact descriptions of Christian joy ever offered in the Western tradition. We cannot close this chapter without speaking of one of the most beloved of all Francis's gifts to the world, the nativity scene, the Christmas creche. On Christmas night in the year 1223, Francis was in the small town of Greccio. He wanted to celebrate the feast of the Incarnation in a way that would help ordinary people feel what it meant, that God became a baby in a stable, in the cold, among the animals, with nothing between heaven and earth except a young mother's love and the bewildered tenderness of a carpenter. He asked a friend to prepare a manger filled with hay in a hillside cave, and to bring a living ox and donkey. He summoned the entire town to come for Mass on Christmas night, with lit torches. The hillside, as the people climbed in the dark, lit up with hundreds of small flames. In the cave beside the manger, a priest celebrated Mass. Francis, who was a deacon, sang the gospel in a voice so full of emotion that everyone present wept. When he preached, he spoke of the child Jesus with a tenderness so deep that it seemed he could see him there. And every time he said the words, the child of Bethlehem, his voice broke, and he pronounced them almost as a bleat, a small animal sound, because love had made language insufficient. The witnesses who were there swore afterward that for a brief shining moment, it seemed there was truly a baby lying in the manger, and that Francis leaned over and took the child into his arm. The vision lasted only a moment, But all who saw it understood that Francis, in his love, had been given something that the rest of them could only barely glimpse. That night in Greccio began a tradition that spread across the Christian world within a generation. Today, in countless homes and churches and public squares, nativity scenes are set out every December. And every one of them carries, whether we know it or not, the fingerprints of Francis. God so close he becomes a baby, so humble he is born in a stable, so generous he holds nothing back. Francis and the modern world, a dwelling place for tonight. And so, dear listener, here we are, at the end of this long and luminous walk through the life of Francis of Assisi. We have traveled with him from his gilded youth to his holy death, from the streets of Assisi to the mountains of Verna, from his first encounter with the leper on the dusty road to his last whispered welcome of Sister Death. What does this man, 800 years gone from the world, say to us tonight? I believe he says, first, that the gospel is possible. We live in an age that has grown quietly cynical about ideals, that evangelical poverty is beautiful in theory, but impossible in practice, that love of enemies is poetic but unrealistic, that peace is a dream the world cannot afford. Francis lived the gospel, not partially, not selectively, not choosing the comfortable parts and quietly setting aside the difficult ones. He lived it completely, without negotiation. And he was not a superhuman figure with abilities the rest of us lack. He was fragile. He had fears. He struggled with pride, with discouragement, with the painful gap between what he wanted to be and what he was. But he opened himself, entirely and repeatedly, to the grace of God, and grace made the impossible possible. If Francis could, we can too. Not all of us are called to barefoot poverty or to preaching to wolves, but we are all called to the same spirit: inner freedom, generous love, deep joy, reverence for creation, and a radical fidelity to Christ that costs us something real. Perhaps you too know what it is to feel that your life is somehow not yet what it is meant to be, that there is a depth available to you that you have not yet found, that beneath the noise of the day and the weight of the night, something is waiting, patient, luminous, simply waiting for you to stop and turn toward it. Francis spent his whole life turning toward it, and in the turning, he found everything. He also reminds us, with particular tenderness for anyone listening tonight who carries sorrow, that holiness is not sadness. Francis was holy, and he was joyful, profoundly, contagiously, mysteriously joyful. He sang, he laughed, he made small jokes to lighten the difficult days. His holiness did not diminish his humanity. It completed it, freed it to be, at last, everything it had always been reaching toward. This joy is available. It is not dependent on your circumstances. It does not require that your life be simple, or your health be good, or your relationships be whole. It requires only the quiet, repeated decision to anchor yourself in God, and to look for beauty and give thanks and love the particular human beings who have been placed in your particular life. He reminds us that creation is sacred. In an age when we are only beginning to understand the cost of treating the world as a resource rather than a home, Francis stands 800 years ahead of us, calling the sun his brother, the water his sister, the wolf his neighbor, not out of romantic sentiment, but out of a theological seeing. Everything that exists reflects the goodness of the one who made it. Everything is family. He reminds us that peace is possible, even when the world provides no evidence for it. He sat in a tent with a sultan in the middle of a crusade and had a real conversation. He stood between a bishop and a mayor, both rigid with pride, and sang them into reconciliation. He faced the wolf of Gubbio, not with a weapon, but with a word. The peace Francis carried was not the peace of someone who had been spared. He had been to prison, to war, to the edges of death. He had carried wounds in his body for 2 years. He had watched the thing he built with his life being slowly, painfully reshaped by forces he could not control. And still he sang. If tonight you are weary, dear listener, if you have carried something long and heavy into this darkness, something that has no easy name, let this be the moment when you set it down. Not because it is solved, not because it will not be there tomorrow, but because tonight, in this hour, you do not have to hold it alone. Francis watches over you from heaven. The God he loved with everything he had loves you with the same extravagance. You are not alone in this darkness. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, let peace enfold you. And remember the last words Francis spoke to his brothers before he died. I have done what was mine to do. May Christ teach you what is yours to do. Each of us has our own road, our own particular calling in our particular life, with the particular gifts and limitations we carry. The task is not to copy Francis exactly. The task is to catch the spirit with which he walked and carry it gently, faithfully into the life that is ours. Sleep draws near now. The night is soft and deep. You have come a long way. Rest here for a while. The final prayer and the gentle descent into sleep. Before we part, I want to thank you for your company along this long and beautiful road. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for opening your heart to this story. If you have come this far, if you have listened through these hours, it is because something in you recognized something in Francis. A resonance, a quiet echo of something you already knew, or always suspected, or have been reaching toward without quite knowing its name. Tend to that seed. Water it with prayer, with a few pages of good reading, with small and concrete acts of love. You will see how it grows. And now, before you surrender to rest, a gentle word. If this space has been of value to you, if these nights with the saints have accompanied you, consoled you, or simply given you somewhere quiet to lay your weariness down, consider subscribing to Saints for Sleep so that every evening a new story of faith and hope will be waiting for you. It costs nothing, and it means everything. And if you feel moved to leave a word in the comments, to share which part of Francis's story touched you most, or to tell us which saint you would like to meet next, your voice matters here. It tells us that this small, quiet space is doing what it was made to do. Now it is time to rest. Close your eyes, if you have not already. Let your body grow heavy. Let it sink, slowly, into whatever holds you. Your mattress, your pillow, the soft weight of your blanket. Release the tensions of this day, one by one, the way a hand releases something it has been holding too long, fingers opening slowly, gently, until the last of it falls away. Breathe in, slowly, without effort, and breathe out, letting the breath carry with it whatever still needs to go. Again, in and out, and again. Let the images of this story settle into your heart now, the way snowflakes settle over a quiet landscape, covering everything in a soft and unblemished white. The cobblestone streets of Assisi in the early morning, the small chapel of the Porciuncula, lit from inside by a single candle, the hillside of Greccio on Christmas night, climbing toward the cave, 100 small flames moving slowly upward through the dark, the leper on the road and Francis dismounting, the birds in the field, tilting their heads to listen, the wolf offering his paw, Brother Leo singing in the winter cold, the stigmata, those wounds that love wrote in flesh, the canticle rising from a room where a man in pain was praising the sun, and that final evening at the Porciuncula, the larks on the roof, the bread broken with wounded hands, the voice growing quieter, and then the smile, and the whisper, and the rest that is not ending, but arrival. Let all of it settle. Let it be real to you, as real as your own breathing. Because this story is not merely something that happened 800 years ago in a city of stone in the hills of Umbria. It is something that is still happening. In the hearts of all who have ever let go of something they clung to, and found on the other side, not loss, but freedom. In the hearts of all who have ever touched the hand of someone the world preferred not to touch. In the hearts of all who have ever sung in the dark. Francis is not a relic. He is a companion. He is present, as the saints are present, close and warm and luminous, in the communion that death cannot dissolve. Imagine him now, if you will, somewhere in the quiet of your room, standing in the corner perhaps, where the light is softest, or sitting nearby, the way a gentle and unhurried friend might sit. His habit is patched and plain. His feet are bare. His hands bear the marks of what love cost him, and they are raised, slowly, with great tenderness, in blessing. He looks at you with the eyes of someone who has seen everything that life can hold, and has found, on the far side of all of it, something that has no end. He smiles, and he says, in that soft voice that could move crowds and still the birds and speak to wolves, he says simply, "Brother, sister, the Lord give you peace. Rest quietly now. God loves you. All is well. All shall be well." May St. Francis intercede for you tonight and always. May the peace of Christ, that peace which the world neither gives nor takes away, fill your heart to the very edges and beyond, so that there is no room left for fear. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May he turn his face towards you and give you peace. Sleep now, dear listener. The night is soft. The God who made the stars also made this hour and gave it to you as a gift. Receive it. Good night, and may the Lord grant you peace. This has been Saints for Sleep. Close your eyes, surrender your burdens, and rest in his peace. Amen. Return soon for more stories that heal the soul.